Here is a motion picture film. Let's tidy up this tangle of film by putting it on a reel.
It's about you and your despair, your lack of hope. Look, people have, throughout history, have woken up in the dead of the night, confronted by blackness, the sense that our lives are without meaning, the sickness unto death.
Yeah, but this is something different.
Yeah, no, man's great achievements have brought him to the place where life as we know it may cease in the foreseeable future. Yes, that's new. But the blackness, that's not.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Film Swap. My name is David Seeley, and I'd like to introduce you to my esteemed co-host, the one and only, incomparable, ecstatic gaucho himself, Mr. Jonathan Pritchard Barrett. Jonathan, how are you?
Very well, thank you very much. Looking forward to this evening.
Yeah, me too. And we've got a very, very special guest for our episode tonight. Perhaps one of the great veterans of film podcasting. He's been the host of Criterion Reflections. How many years have you been doing that now, David?
Well, I started the blog in 2008 as just a standalone blog, but in 2017, I think I switched over to an audio podcast, and I've been working my way through the Criterion collection in the chronological order of the films as they were released, starting with Nanook of the North, and I'm currently, from 1921. And then when I got to the year 1969, this is when I did the podcast. And now I'm working my way through 1973. I'm making very slow progress, but I am plugging away. And I do cover things that are on the Criterion channel, old Laserdisc titles that never made it to DVD or Blu-ray or 4K or whatever. So, it's a very broad interpretation of the Criterion collection, but it's really just an excuse to talk about films with friends that I've made online and, just kind of look at movies from the past and what they say to us today. That's my little gimmick, I guess you could call it. But it has been a fun experiment, and it's definitely led me to meet people who share my taste, or at least, my interest in these films, including yourself, David. And we're really pleased to reconnect with you here, having had the chance to meet you and your family in person this past August when my wife and I took a tour of England. So a real memorable highlight, just one of the benefits of this little hobby of mine.
Yeah, it was really nice. We had a really nice Sunday afternoon at Kew Gardens, and we met your lovely wife, and we spent a few hours hanging out there, and we had a beer together, and it was a really, whoa.
Hand off the mic.
I'm leaving that in, Jonathan, because that looked really cool. But anyway, David, that was a great.
And I'm
great
from Michigan here, just to kind of flash that. I'm in Grand Rapids, Michigan, USA, by Lake Michigan there. So this is an international podcast today.
Absolutely, and you also are the co-host of another podcast called Inside the Box, which is sort of an offshoot of the Criterion Reflections, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was something that my friend Trevor Barrett and I, kind of my first big podcasting gig was actually a program called The Eclipse Viewer, where I was talking about the movies in the Criterion Collection's Eclipse series back when they were producing them. These are DVD bare bones sets that are kind of collected around either a particular director or actor, sometimes a theme or a period of time. And so that each box set sort of told its own story. And these are films that probably wouldn't stand muster for single standalone release, or at least most of them wouldn't. A few have been subsequently released on Blu-ray, like The Ascent, great film from Larissa Shepitko. But basically, Trevor and I just developed a really nice rapport. We'd watch each of the films and have a podcast episode, kind of giving listeners a chance to know what to expect, or if they've watched them, they can kind of get in on the conversation. But after they stopped making the Eclipse series, we kind of ran out of material, so we decided to do Inside the Box, which is looking at those Criterion box sets and reviewing them in kind of the same format. We've taken I think we took all of 2024 off, not by plan, but I actually just had an exchange with Trevor the other day, and we are planning to resume that. Talking about the Michael Haneke box set. So we just kind of went in some different directions. We were still good friends and still very willing to do this. It's not like we had a falling out or anything, but that is on the agenda for early January. So I'm looking forward to getting into that set and reconnecting with Trevor and publishing a new episode of that series.
Oh, brilliant. Well, that's definitely look forward to that, because you do, listeners, if you like film podcasts, definitely Criterion Reflections and Inside the Box, and the historical episodes of Eclipse Viewer as well.
Yeah.
There's like a lot of really great conversation there around some really, really interesting films, and it's definitely worth seeking out. So
the website is criterioncast.com, so maybe put a link in the notes there. But yeah, criterioncast.com is where I publish my stuff, and I'm pretty much the main contributor there these days. But it's a podcast, it's a website that's been around, I think, since 2009. So there's a ton of material on there, reviews and articles, all kinds of stuff, old podcasts. So yeah, there's a real archive to be dug through if you want to take the time to do that.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, definitely highly recommended, folks. And today we've brought David on board for a really special episode. We thought, as it was getting close to Christmas, it might be nice to examine, because I think it's fair to say this has been a pretty dreadful year for anyone who reads the newspapers or looks at the news, or even just personally, there's a lot of hard times for a lot of people economically and in a lot of ways, and we thought it might be interesting to explore the idea of resilience, or keeping faith. And that could mean in a religious sense, or it could just mean, as I say, like just personal resilience, or how people overcome adversity or difficult times, or when they're struggling with their mental health, or just trying to keep on top of things. And it's an interesting topic to explore about how people keep going even when things are really awful, or they seem really awful. So that's what we wanted to talk about tonight. And David is just the perfect man to do it. And we've with us, and we've each of us, we usually have two films, but tonight we've each thought it would be appropriate for everyone to pick their own film, and something that tackles this subject from something that personally resonated with each of us. So we've picked three really interesting films that we're going to talk about. And the first one, I think, it's a more recent film, or at least in I guess from the perspective of a lot of the films that we talk about, it's quite recent. And we're going to hand it over to David. This is the film that he picked to bring to the table tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to David to introduce the film and talk a little bit about why he chose it. And then we can have a little discussion around it.
All right. So in our little preliminary chat, David's inquiry to me, like, would I want to be on an episode? Well, we actually even talked about guesting when we were walking through Kew Gardens on that beautiful Sunday afternoon. And of course, I'm open to it. I think this is it my second time on your podcast? Is that correct?
It is indeed, yes.
Yeah, we did the gangster movies.
For our gangster episode a little while back.
That was a lot of fun. So so from gangsters to faith, what's the through line there, right? Well, so basically David pitched it as an episode of faith on film, and faith is a word that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and he kind of did that. But I definitely thought about the religious application. I thought, well, you think about faith on film, you've got Carl Theodor Dreyer, you've got Ingmar Bergman, you've got Tarkovsky, you've got Bresson. Those are the classic art house depictions of faith. Which one would I want to do? And I knew the other film titles that you would select. I thought, well, how about a movie that kind of combines all of them into one? And that is Paul Schrader's First Reformed. I'll hold that up to the camera there. There's Ethan Hawke, his face bisected by a cross and a line of fire behind him. This is a 2017 film that was directed by Paul Schrader. And it's not just a sort of, the topic and the subject matter, but Paul Schrader himself and I have a lot of common connections. He is also from the same area, Grand Rapids, Michigan. He and I both graduated from what was at the time called Calvin College. Now it's Calvin University. He's some years older than me. He graduated, I think, in the early 70s. I was an adult, kind of a continuing ed. I didn't graduate until the 90s, although I probably should have graduated in the early 80s age-wise. But in any case, we are kind of cut from the same cultural cloth as far as our backgrounds are concerned, and he's got a pretty prominent connection to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and so he's a little bit of a local legend. And I actually happened to see First Reformed at its West Michigan premiere with Paul Schrader in attendance, where he did a Q&A at the end of the film.
Oh.
So it was a pretty moving experience. Of course, we didn't know exactly what we were in for, but as far as the title, Reformed churches are kind of the theological tradition of John Calvin, Puritanism, and of course Britain has its own kind of history with all of that. But in West Michigan, there's a pretty strong Dutch community, which both Schrader and I kind of come out of. Although on my dad's side, my last name Blakeslee is a British or English name. Anyways, we're very used to this kind of environment that's depicted in the film of a traditional, predominantly white, conservative evangelical church, and then also the presence of the megachurch that's kind of bought the property that this pastor is managing. So very quick, that's background as far as my personal connection. This film is just loaded with all kinds of interesting stuff to talk about, so many different topics that are current, controversial, compelling, not easily resolved. But the gist of the story is that Ernest Toller, he's a pastor who's left the military chaplaincy to become a sort of a private denominational preacher after the death of his son, who went to war in Iraq, lost his life there, and he's going through kind of a crisis of guilt and responsibility. He's a man of the cloth. He's been preaching and sharing the gospel and praying with people, but he's going through his own sort of existential crisis because of the loss of his son. His wife broke up with him after the death, and now he's beginning to even question the fundamental principles. Why am I even doing this? But he's in his robe, he's in his church. It's a tiny congregation, a lot of echoes of Ingmar Bergman's Winter Light going on here, and we'll get to some of those other influences. But he encounters this young couple, a woman who's got concerns about her husband. He's a very strong environmental activist, very distressed about the reality of climate change and the implications for future generations. His wife is now pregnant. They're going to bring a child into this world, but the husband doesn't really even want the child to be born. He has a moral qualm about bringing new life into a planet that's on its way to extinction. He's kind of the worst case scenario view of the environmental challenges that we face. And because the wife is concerned about her husband, she's thought, well, here's a minister, maybe he can talk some sense into him, or we can get his counsel to work through this dilemma. I don't know how spoiler we want to get, and I don't want to get the whole plot of the film, but it really just brings up all these issues about the application of traditional religious beliefs to the issues of contemporary life. There's questions about the influence of big money and big business in institutional organized religion, the censorship of messages you can't really deliver from the pulpit because of the business implications and the mixture of money and politics and religion and the American kind of economy and power structure, and just the ethical questions. The pastor also has an alcoholism problem, and he's kind of going through his own realization of the effect that it's taking on his physical as well as his mental health. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. But I've maybe gone on a little bit long enough to kind of get the conversation started. Kind of wanted to hear what you guys had to say about the film. I found it very moving, very relatable, and I've watched it probably 5 or 6 times now, and I always find something tantalizing and stimulating about it. I've not gotten into the overexposure yet with this movie. So
Okay.
follow up on that.
John, do you want to pick up on your thoughts about First Reformed?
Sure. Well, I really enjoyed it. I hadn't actually heard of it before you recommended it or suggested it for your title. And I work with a number of sort of film buffs, and I mentioned it to them. I think two of them had seen it, and they both really rated it. And but luckily, that didn't spoil it. I really, really enjoyed it. Yeah, really good. Very. Well, it's quite a bleak film.
Oh, absolutely. It's all the worst kind of situations on the individual personal level to the global, cosmic level, even if you want to get into the meaning of it all, right?
Exactly. So yeah, it is very much from the personal to the most sort of global and even universal. But I really enjoyed it. And there is sort of hope in it. And yeah, the performances are absolutely top notch as well. Old Ethan Hawke and Amanda Seyfried, both terrific. I mean, everybody else is as well. I like the fact that everybody's got sort of sides to them. They're sort of, everybody is wrestling with something, I guess. And there's no. Everybody's very human. They're very human characters, which I really enjoyed. And I mean, amazing. It looks extraordinary as well because it's all sort of set in winter with this sort of, there's no foliage, and the church that they film in is this very sort of austere, beautifully austere, or austerely beautiful church. And what a movie! All I knew of. I'm not as well sort of watched as you two, and I knew sort of Taxi Driver, of course.
Schrader is the screenwriter there. Yeah,
exactly. And so he wrote and directed this, and I guess there's certain sort of commonalities there. I guess you've got maybe a bit of Dostoevsky in there as well, amongst his many influences. And yeah, just an extraordinary film, and one that I would definitely watch again. Great. Really good. Thank you very much for recommending it.
Oh, for sure.
David.
Great. Well, yeah, I mean, this is the second time I watched it. I saw it roughly when it came out, probably, in its original release cycle when it kind of came out, I saw it. And at the time, although I did very much enjoy it, I probably didn't connect with it as much as I did this time. Because for some reason, this time I really, really connected with Ethan Hawke's character. Maybe it has something to do with my own time in life and my own sort of circumstances at the minute, but I felt really sort of a lot of empathy with him and really connected with how he was feeling, what he was going through. And I found it really, really powerful. I thought the way that he slowly, because he was already kind of in a dark place and already kind of overwhelmed with all these feelings, as you said, David, about guilt and remorse and sort of questioning exactly what he's doing, and sort of that he's gotten into this, in his church, there isn't a lot of people coming anymore. He's just kind of going through these routines, but he doesn't really feel anymore like he's really connecting with people on that level. And in a sense that it's almost like a lifeline to him when this lady comes to him and says, hey, I've got this problem with my husband. And he becomes so entrenched and involved in this man's own struggles with his worries and anxieties about things, and maybe his frustrations with the lack of success that his activism has had. And that he's sort of become a bit burnt out. But Ethan Hawke's character kind of gets drawn into that, and you can really feel that sense of that it's almost like he's trying to find something to latch onto, isn't he?
To restore that sense of restore that sense of meaning and purpose, because I mean, maybe one spoiler, it's fairly early in the film where the young man, the environmental guy, takes his own life and does it in a way that really puts Reverend Toller right in the middle. He's the one who finds the body, and he also finds this suicide vest that the activist, we don't know if he was planning to use it imminently or he just sort of had it there in case the right circumstances developed. But now he's got this lethal weapon, and that's another issue of terrorism and the use of violence to get a point across, with the futility or the frustration or the enormous stakes of the crisis at hand, whether that's a political thing, an oppressive government, or in this case an economic and social cause about our destruction of the environment and our reliance on fossil fuels and all of that. I mean, these are big issues, and even though they're maybe overwhelming, you can't just wave them away. And this is a film that really tries to wrestle with all of that while making it connected to sort of everyday life stuff that we're all going through, over the course of our years. So.
Yeah, and sorry, Jonathan, you go ahead.
No. Well, I was. Yeah, that's the one of the great things about it is these massive questions, and somehow it seems that the reason doesn't provide answers with this thing, and that that's why it's really a matter of faith. Even something like the environment is obviously something that's rational, we could say. The answers seem rational, but at the same time, it does seem like there's a lot of faith involved in it. How should you respond? Should you respond with despair or not? That's essentially not something that's subject to reason, really.
I mean, we can't really say that the activist, I mean, I can't say he was on the right path or that he made a well-founded decision to take his life and leave his pregnant wife and child, behind.
Yeah.
I mean, so, but that's the effect that this dilemma has pushed him into. And now the survivors have to figure out what are they going to do. And when you feel like you've got an issue that you want to speak to on the preacher side, he wants to bring this message to the community, and yet he's being oppressed by the business interests who are the major donors to this commemorative event. He's the pastor of this church, but he's really like running a tourist attraction is what it is, because it's a relic of bygone days, which also calls into question his preaching, his message. Is that just kind of sort of carried over superstitions from centuries gone by, or are you really talking about what's actually going on in a meaningful way?
So many of the characters in the film are just within this absolute crisis of self-doubt and questioning their faith and what it is they believe in and how they can best make an impact. But it's interesting that the one character who seems to be unshaken in their faith and their belief is the businessman. He's one of the patrons of the church, and he obviously they say that he works for some sort of energy company. So obviously he falls on the other side of the environmental debate in terms of he's like I guess what some people would call a climate denier or whatever. But he seems to be completely solid and unwavering in his beliefs and in his in the institutions that he sort of represents.
It's about money and power and clout, and that is kind of the situation that the United States is dealing with right now, because the side that prevailed primarily in the most recent election is that kind of drill baby drill, to use one of their slogans, of just maximum extraction of natural resources, even to the point of forestalling the conversion to electric vehicles. We want to keep burning gas and oil because that's where the money's made. And it becomes this kind of defiant posture, but because it's delivered with such assurance and no self-doubt or self-critique at all, that proves to be persuasive to so many people. Right.
Yeah. And it's backed up by these power structures, these institutions, as you say, whereas the husband or the Ethan Hawke's character, or sorry, I keep calling him Ethan Hawke's character, but what was his
Toller,
name?
Ernest Toller, yeah, Reverend
Ernest
Toller,
Toller, yes.
yeah,
Just trips off the tongue. Maybe that's why I remembered it. So they have to, in a sense, kind of beat up against a wall, don't they, in order to
yeah.
try and get their message across, or at least that's how it maybe
They're the
seems to them.
voices, yeah. They're the voices in the wilderness that nobody's really listening to, and they're isolated.
Yeah.
They don't really have much community. They don't have any power to fall back on. They may have a group of fellow believers, but they don't really amount to much when you go up against the big boys.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, everyone is like clearly kind and good natured and means well with what they're doing. But when it constantly feels like it's totally ineffectual and not really having any impact, then you can understand where all the doubts and and sometimes the rage as well, which is kind of represented by that, by the bomb jacket, that's how sometimes that frustration and that sort of those feelings of not being able to make an impact manifest themselves in that rage, and that leads to violence and things like that. So
well, and the nature of the suicide bomber. Yes, I'm going to die, but I'm going to take about as many of you bastards as I can with me, and inflict as much pain as I can, because I have nothing left to lose. You've stripped me from whatever I've considered valuable, so now you are going to have to suffer as I and the cause or the people I represent has. I mean, we just went through this in the United States with the street killing of a CEO of a healthcare company by a guy who's been kind of elevated to sort of a Robin Hood status, or a folk hero by some. And boy, that's a pretty indicting statement. And I understand the sentiments about resenting those who live lives of unimaginable comfort and ease and power and privilege, and they just kind of skate on by without accountability, even though they're making decisions that really do materially impose suffering on people who didn't deserve it. With an insurance denial, now you've got bankruptcy or years of saving and trying to do things the right way, and now it's all blown out because you've got $150,000 bill and no way to cover that. These are real dilemmas, and I just appreciated Schrader's willingness to kind of throw them out there. I mean, I think it's a very well constructed film. We don't have to talk a little bit about the making of and all that, but there's a lot of fun stuff from a cinephile perspective as well going on.
Yeah, and you mentioned Winter Light. I mean, that was the film that it most sort of conjured up to me, just even stylistically and in terms of the central protagonist and his dilemmas and the suicide and all those things. Very much to me kind of made me think of Winter Light the most.
Well, yeah. Well, if I would throw a little anecdote in there. At the Q&A where Schrader was present, I actually did have a chance to ask him the question. Of course, this is after my very first viewing. I said, so I noticed that there's an homage to Ingmar Bergman's Winter Light. Can you just tell us more about that? He said very indignantly, that was not an homage. That was blatant theft. It's like, let's just cut the crap and get right down to it. Yeah,
he said it, so we didn't say that. He said that. But even like you can see elements of even Taxi Driver in there in terms of, and again, which Paul Schrader wrote the screenplay for Taxi Driver, but with the narration and the sort of various scenes of him kind of driving in cars and sort of commenting sort of in a detached way about sort of some of the things that we're seeing on screen, and that kind of conjures up that style of Taxi Driver, doesn't it? And there are other things in there as well. I mean, like you say, we could probably spend 15 minutes sort of just picking out little sort of bits from films, but it might be best to let the viewers do that.
Yeah, Schrader's kind of groove is the troubled man in a room. That's kind of the essence of a lot of his movies. He's a guy with a lot of issues and a lot of stuff on his mind, and he's sitting in a room figuring out what he's going to do about it all. So,
yeah.
in the bathroom often, sort of looking at the mirror.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
other thing too. I mean, just the alcoholism, the peeing
Yeah,
blood.
the
Yeah, the
health
health
issues
issues.
that he's having, and the
Exactly.
fact that he's not really dealing with them,
Hmm.
just sort of, because I mean, lots of people do that. I'm guilty of doing that sometimes if I
Yeah.
have a certain ache or pain or something that's troubling me, but it's not quite serious enough to make me go, oh, I'm going to go down to the doctor and see about
Right.
this. And lots of people do that. I think
Hmm.
especially men do that.
Sure.
That's a thing that you kind of, oh, I don't want to make a fuss about this. It'll go away on its own. It's not going to be a problem.
Hmm.
So you just kind of keep ignoring things, and
Yeah.
there's a real danger in that, and there's a real sort of an element of self-destruction in that. And even though he's having all these stomach issues and things, he's still knocking back the whiskey and all these things.
And putting the
So
Pepto Bismol in there to kind of
yeah, yeah,
coat
yeah.
his stuff.
I can't think of anything that would be more ineffective than that, really.
Wow. Yeah.
But yeah, so all those things you can kind of identify with it on that level about the self-medicating and
Hmm.
the self-denial about that about how you're feeling and about what's going on with you. And I think anyone can identify. I think the film has a lot of really universal sort of elements to it that anyone could identify with. So
And it's open to interpretation. He's not didactic. He's not telling you this is how you resolve all
yeah,
this stuff, or this is the way that you should even understand these issues. He's just
Yeah,
raising them and letting the viewer sort it out on their own terms.
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of times with the environmental stuff that there's a couple scenes like during the funeral down at the sort of the riverbank, and
Yeah.
the people singing the little song, and it is almost sort of, it was in its banality, it was almost comical, and I kind of
Hmm.
thought, well, oh, is he kind of poking fun at these issues a little bit? But then there are other times in the film when you think, well, no, he's actually seriously presenting these issues as a real something that he wants the viewer to be thinking about, and he's adding those things in a serious way to the mix.
mm,
And I think the
Hmm.
film does a really great job of doing that. It's because on some levels there are scenes in it that are a bit kind of comical or seem
Yeah.
satirical, but then at the same time there is this sort of underlying feeling of dread that goes all the way through it as well.
Hmm.
So it really sort of effectively kind of rides those things. And like you said, it doesn't judge anything. It just sort of throws all these elements in there, but it's not asking the viewer to definitely take one view or the other on these things. It's kind
yeah,
of asking you to just think about it and make up your own mind about that.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, he's an observer of American culture, and he's pretty insightful. I mean, Paul Schrader is kind of legendary for his Facebook feed.
really.
He's got oh yeah, he's very much worth a follow. Just I mean, he may his friends list may be full, but you can still follow him, and his takes. I mean, he speaks his mind without varnish. And he can sometimes be a little bit abrasive, but in a
Oh,
very funny way. But he's
right.
really quite a character, and he's had a long career, kind of working in sort of the margins. But he's directed a number of films, and he's still
Yeah,
producing stuff. There's a film called Oh Canada that just opened wide.
yeah,
This weekend here in the States. I haven't checked
amazing.
it out yet, but I definitely will make a priority of it. That's with Richard Gere.
Yeah, it just
So
came out here too.
oh
yeah,
right.
yep,
Oh,
yep.
okay.
So he's still he's in his upper 70s now, but he's still a very spry and you know uh, he's a communicator, and I think he's an important figure. He's definitely created an interesting body of work for our
Hmm.
times.
Yeah, it's I really enjoyed it. I loved the sort of discussion of like one of the I really like the character of the head pastor Joel Jeffers of the
Oh
Abundant.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. By Cedric the Entertainer, which is kind of how he's known. I think they give him his actual name in the credits, but he's a
okay,
black comedian, kind of a freewheeling, funny guy.
right.
When I first saw him, I was like, oh my goodness, this is like not expected, and
Okay,
there he
so I
is.
haven't seen
Yeah.
him before, but he's very sort of charismatic,
Oh
sort
yeah.
of laid back. He's like completely different to everybody else in the film, who's sort of completely basically on
Yeah.
the verge of a nervous breakdown.
Right, no, he's a charismatic megachurch pastor. He's kind of part entertainer, pop psychologist, advice
Right.
giver, gives a good speech, tells stories, makes people feel better about themselves and feel part
Yeah.
of a community. So he's got a pretty solid gig going there. But he also knows the ins and outs and the pressures of the pastoral ministry,
Yeah.
and that you are dealing with some serious stuff in the life of your congregation. You know,
Mm.
people dying and tragedies and you know, all the issues that people are dealing with. You can't just be up there as a song and dance guy. So he's a fascinating character, and that's another just a big sort of cultural issue that our nation, our society is going through right now, is about the role of religion in public life, and how seriously do you take it, and the money and the clout behind it. Obviously, when it gets into the political level, that's a whole nother twist on things. So yeah, just so much food for thought there, and appreciate the chance to share this movie with you guys.
Great.
One of my favorite little moments of it was when when Ethan Hawke and he have the confrontation in his office, and when Ethan Hawke starts to talk about his environmental concerns or those issues, how the pastor turns his back on him. He literally
spins in
turns
his
his chair around and just sort of puts his back to him and just kind of goes, you know, with this look on his face of just like, oh, like this. And I thought that was a really brilliant, sort of subtle little sort of touch. And
Let's
there's a
just
lot
not
of
go
those.
there. It's too divisive. People don't want to hear about that, you know?
Yeah, it's just a brilliant film. And can I just ask you guys one, without giving, for people who might not have had the chance to see the film yet, the ending to me seems kind of ambiguous almost in a way.
Yeah.
But I was curious about your interpretations of it. As did you see that as a hopeful ending or something else? I guess I'm just curious because I'm not sure how I felt about it. Having seen it twice now, I still sort of am on the fence about how to interpret that. So I was just curious about what you guys thought of it.
Well, I thought two things. Firstly, I thought it was open, so you could see it either. But personally, I took it as hopeful because I prefer that approach, basically.
Yeah.
But I thought
it's a statement.
Yeah,
it's a statement about love and connection as kind of the through line that's going to get us through these moments of despair and you know, all hope is abandoned. You know, it's also kind of an artistic easy out. He sets up all of these, you know, what's going to happen next, all of this stuff, and I think you know, especially on that first watch, it's pretty abrupt, and we were in the theater thinking, okay, what's actually going to happen? You know, everything's on edge here, you know, without getting into the details.
Like a thriller, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then he just sort of, you know, fades it to black, and so you're right, it's very open-ended and it's artistic, but for people who are looking for that resolution ending, it might be a little bit infuriating too, because he just sort of says, okay, I'm done telling my story now, without wait a minute, you know. So because it is kind of an impossible dilemma that it actually ends in, and that's all you get.
Well, such is life, right?
It is exactly.
It's brilliant. It's a really great film, and I would say for watching it the second time, I enjoyed it. Like I said, I made more of a connection to it, I think, on the second time that I'm watching it, and I really I think this is a really great film. So it seems like you guys concur there as well. So.
Well, brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
So, David, thank you very much for recommending this film to us and to whoever's listening out there. So please go and check it out. First Reform. It's available in the UK. I'm assuming, Jonathan, you probably just accessed it via one of the streaming platforms.
I did. I think it was actually Prime. It was on or maybe YouTube, one or the other. I paid for it. It was sort of an add-on. I think it was £2.50. What's that, sort of $320, something like that. And
Yeah, same with me. I would buy that on Blu-ray, but I don't have it. So I did rent it as well on Prime Video.
yeah,
And David held up
Yeah,
his Blu-ray already in the US, so it is
yeah,
definitely available for
and it
physical media.
and it does have a Paul Schrader director's commentary on it as well. So if you really want to get into his process and just hear some of his stories and his kind of rascally old man voice, it's worth it.
the old man voice.
Yeah.
Well,
He's a great curmudgeon if you like that character type. Yeah.
well, on that note, on Old Rascals, I
Yeah.
think it might be time for us to move on now. And I'm going to hand it over to an old rascal here, my good friend Jonathan Pritchard Barrett, and he's going to introduce his choice on the Keeping the Faith theme. So, Jonathan, take her away.
Well, my film, I think mine's the most sort of well-known of the three films, maybe. That's my hunch.
I
I
think
would
that's
think so.
probably a fair thing to say. Yeah.
Yeah, and it certainly had the most Oscar nominations. It had, I think, 9 Oscar nominations, although it didn't win any. And mine is The Elephant Man, and it's released in 1980, directed by David Lynch, partially written by him, and it stars Anthony Hopkins, John Hurt, Anne Bancroft, John Gielgud, a number of other big talents, but those are the main ones. And if you don't know The Elephant Man, I mean, to me, it's an absolutely terrific movie. Now I've watched it a number of times, and I was because when I rewatched it sort of this week, wondering, will it stand up against these two amazing films? And it does. It's still an absolutely, magnificent film. And basically, it tells the story of this chap. In the film, he's called John Merrick. He's actually Joseph Merrick, and he had some disease that basically made his sort of skin and bones sort of grow, and he had these sort of, basically, I don't know, I was wondering how to phrase it, basically deformities, physical deformities. I'm sure there may be a more sort of a better way of phrasing it, but that seems everybody would understand that. And this is set in the Victorian era, so I guess in the 1880s. He dies in 1890, and he is sort of found in basically what they call a freak show, a sort of circus, and he's being exhibited as the Elephant Man by this sort of circus impresario guy, and he gets sort of rescued by Dr. Treves, and it's based on a true story. Dr. Treves worked in the London Hospital, which was in the East End. The East End of London, if you're not from the UK, is basically the sort of the poorer part of town. And so he basically he was being exhibited in a shop, a sort of deserted shop in real life, and the hospital was on the other side, is on the other side of the road. I think that it's still there, and the shop, you can see the shop on the Wikipedia page, actually, or the outside of it, now sells saris. And he gets taken away and sort of looked after, and because he's being horribly abused by his this chap who's, he calls him his owner, essentially.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it seems like for the first time in his life he encounters sort of kindness, and then later on it sort of goes sort of not so well. Basically, he gets without giving too much away, he gets sort of kidnapped and taken off again, and then comes back. But he lives the rest of his life in this, most of the rest of his life in this hospital, and he's being sort of shown to other doctors, and we wonder, is this part of like a sort of more respectable form of exhibitionism? It's basically the same sort of thing, except it's by the medical profession, and then and somehow he becomes a sort of cause célèbre with all these sort of wealthy and people in London, and they all start visiting him and bringing him gifts. But and you will wonder if this is part of this sort of his being a exhibit again. But really, to me, the film is it's extremely profound. It's amazingly moving. But basically it's about sort of brotherhood and kindness, And the way David Lynch describes it in one interview he gives, he says he's a fantastic soul, and he is this extraordinary man who has really some of the worst sort of experiences that you could imagine. This awful physical condition, and enduring awful suffering and sort of bullying by basically pretty much everybody he meets. And then suddenly people are kind to him, and it's just sort of pretty simple in a way. They're just nice to him, and he just really responds to this. But he also, although he's not a priest, but he has a very deep faith. And this is one of the sort of, I guess it's a slightly subtle themes throughout the film. So one of when they realize that first of all, they think he is mute, he can't speak. And then they put him in a room and managed to teach him the 23rd Psalm, and then he carries on speaking it after the bit that he'd been taught. And they realize actually he knows the whole Psalm and is actually intelligent. But it turned out that he did, in sort of the records, he did have this sort of deep faith, and that sort of, and you get the feeling that this is what sort of kept him going. And I think that's what attracted him to David Lynch, because David Lynch, he's a keen sort of TM practitioner, and which is all about the sort of inner faith, basically, or inner peace. And this guy has this amazing, he's suffering, definitely, but he has this amazing faith or inner peace despite his outer circumstances. And it's just it's a remarkable effect that he has on people as well. They sort of burst into tears because he's this somebody that you would expect to have a very different attitude to the one he does have. And it sort of, his amazing innocence and hopefulness really reduces people who encounter him to sort of gibbering wrecks. Like, I can't believe this. He's like almost like a saint, actually, which is what we get to in our third film. And I read, one of the things I read was some guy who's into magic with a K, CK, as in the sort of like the, doing a ritual magic practice. And he said, I think that Joseph Merrick is like a sort of a saint of magic, or a magical saint, or something like this. Anyway, but he is a sort of saintly character, basically. And and the performances are top notch. And so one of the themes, I'll leave it there because I've been going on. Come on. Yeah, it's amazing. Anyway, sorry.
No, well, that's great. Is this a favorite of yours, Jonathan? Like a favorite film?
I think it is actually a favorite of mine. Yeah, I guess I saw it in the 90s, and then I saw it. I remember when it came out. My mum was talking about it a lot for some reason. It was sort of popular with her friends in the sort of early 80s, but I wasn't going to watch it then. I was 8 or 9 or 10 or something. And then I did see it in the 90s and enjoyed it. And then I re-saw it in about 2000. And I remember then being incredibly moved by it. Incredibly moved. And then I watched it a couple of times in the last year. And also just think it's absolutely brilliant. It really stands up. So,
yeah, that's great.
Okay, well, it's great. So, David, did you want to share your thoughts about The Elephant?
Sure. Yeah. Well, now I had seen Eraserhead, which is Lynch's first feature film, as a midnight movie in the late 70s, when it was kind of just breaking out and kind of becoming a sensation, and that put David Lynch on the map. And I knew about him as an interesting young filmmaker, and this was kind of his follow-up, his first big break. And he was definitely in the underground and the avant-garde and the not in a sort of respectable big budget production like this one turned out to be. And that cast, you've mentioned a bunch of names. Wendy Hiller's another one who's kind of a Hall of Fame level of acting talent, going way back into like the 30s of British cinema. So he's working with some very venerable characters about a story that was at the time kind of this revival of interest in this character. I think there maybe had been a novelization, or it was a Broadway play, I believe. And so they made it into this film. So, I saw it back in its original release, had not revisited it in for many years until Criterion put it out as a Blu-ray, several years ago. And of course, Lynch went on to create so many other outstanding films, but this is really the one that enabled him, I think, in so many ways to have the career that he's went on to have. And so when I first heard about it, it's like, faith, well, what's the connection here? But I think, Jono, you made all those points very eloquently. Yeah, this is a movie about resilience, finding hope. I mean, it's not even the fact that he's got this deformity. I mean, that sounds painful and miserable enough, but the fact that he is seen by every set of eyes that gazes upon him as this horrific monster, like this nightmare come to life. And that's who he is, and he cannot change his presentation other than to hide it. And he can't communicate because the deformity affects his ability to speak clearly, and he's probably been very inhibited and shamed, and who knows what kind of psychological mess of torments he was, or had every reason to be, except for the fact that something propelled him through rather than just kill yourself and be out of your misery. So you're right. There's an incredible character study going on here. My wife and I rewatched it right after we got back from England because it's a great London movie as well, and we just wanted to kind of continue that experience. And so the Victorian era and the East End, we visited not any of those locations, but I have a much better appreciation of the geography of London and what the different districts sort of represent in the popular imagination. As I told David when we were visiting, I was doing a lot of research on British history and culture, and of course the city of London was just at the center of all of that. So I love this movie on so many different levels, and I think you're right. It fits this theme very, very superbly. So yeah, that's just an opening comment there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything you guys said, really. I love this film. I saw it first when I was a teenager, back kind of more or less when it was a new film, or within a few years of it being a new film. And it made quite an impact on me then. And then it was quite a number of years before I revisited it. I've watched it several times just in the last couple of years, kind of getting ready for this show because we've had quite a few misstarts in recording this particular theme for this episode. This is a really profoundly moving film, I think. And it's interesting to compare it when we talked about the first film and First Reform, and about how some people, like if you look at the character of the husband who commits suicide because he's troubled with the anxieties around environmental, issues and things, and how even that he wasn't able to cope, and somehow that dragged him to such a pit of despair that he felt compelled to take his own life. But here you have a character who just would have lived a life of just sort of unspeakable sort of sadness and brutality and suffering, and yet, like Jonathan said, he's still remained positive and kind and hopeful even through all of that. So just in comparing and contrasting those two things, you really have to be moved by this person. And like you say, the film does have so much about the impact that he has on other people, and obviously on it brings out the dark side in a lot of people who see him as a vulnerable person and as you said, like a monster or a subject of ridicule. But he also, in a lot of people, brings out a lot of kindness and a lot of hope in them as well. And I think it's really effective in conveying that. It was interesting today. I rewatched it today, and I thought as I was going to watch it today anyway, I actually encouraged my kids to come and watch it with me. So we sat down and we watched it as a family. And initially they were not keen, I'll be honest with you, because it's an older black and white film, and they looked at the trailer and it looked like this, a bunch of, old black and white people talking and stuff. So it was kind of like
Yeah.
selling, like eating a gravel sandwich or something, was in terms of trying to get them to sit down and engage with it. But again, once the film started, they were absolutely totally
Yeah.
engaged with it, and very there were several times when my kids would look over at me with really sad expressions on their face, or horrified expressions, or everyone got a little bit
Yeah.
sort of soppy towards the end and things as well.
Hmm.
And my one son, just my youngest, really sort of was troubled by the idea that he
Mm.
died at the end. He was kind of
Mm,
like, so is he dead? Did he die?
mm,
And he seemed quite sort of affected by that. So I think, and I remember I couldn't have been, I must have been sort of maybe 13, 14 when I
Hmm.
first saw this. So it's a really moving film and really powerful.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
um, yeah, definitely worth checking out for people who haven't seen it. And I think it does fit really well in with the theme, um, about just hanging on to something that gets you through, that pulls you through even the absolute worst possible
Yeah.
um, conditions. That somehow
Right.
people manage to find the strength to just keep going and to stay positive, and it's an admirable quality,
Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah. His clinging to that picture of his mother, saying,
Mm,
this is where I come from. I am not this freak of nature. I am not this subhuman. Um, there's something that happened to my body that put it in this condition, and that even raises these big questions. Well, if there's a loving God, why does an innocent person have to be born with this condition? And
Mm,
you talk about a deformity. It's like he's got clusters of excessive tissue, like barnacles on his body. And then
yeah.
apparently they did a pretty historically accurate representation or replication. Even
mm,
some of the casts that were made of his of his shape, if you will, after he passed away. They wanted to preserve this for medical science, and so yeah, it looks almost like something so unusual or bizarre, like only
Mm,
some demented fantasy could have come up with this, but this was a real human being that grew into this. And so yeah, it raises all of those big questions too about meaning and purpose, and how do you persevere when everything seems to tell you your life is messed up. It's not really worth persevering or going on.
yeah.
And yeah, you could maybe draw some of those conclusions from the ending. Maybe his suffering had just taken its toll, but he had
mm,
had that redemptive ability to connect and transcend the limits of his deformity. So
mm,
there is, it's a sad reality. We're all going to die, but it's what do you do with those years and those
mm.
circumstances that you're given, um, to make the best of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't really even see the ending as I'm sorry for people if we're spoiling, but
Well,
I think because
yeah,
this is based on sort of a historical
yeah.
figure, it's not so much of a spoiler really.
Yeah.
Well, it
But
seems like he's laying himself down,
yeah,
knowing that he's in a position that's not going to be sustainable for him physically. Yeah.
yeah, but I mean, I think even though it's obviously sad that he chose to do that, the implication
Hmm.
was that that they kind of knew he was dying anyway,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and also it was kind of hopeful in the sense that he enjoyed that one last really great day that was kind of for him almost like a
Hmm.
perfect day
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
just joy and friendship and happiness and
Yeah.
all those things. So it was kind of like going out on a high sort of thing to say,
Hmm.
well, this
Hmm.
is about as perfect as it can get.
Yeah.
So maybe this is the time, and so I didn't see the ending, or I don't see the ending as being necessarily, I mean, it's sad and poignant, but it's also, I think, in its own way kind of hopeful too,
Mhm.
in the sense that, you know, you could see that he, you know, and I mean, there's the stuff at the end about how it's not really the end because we're all part
Right.
of something much bigger and much, you know, you know, more than just ourselves. So,
Mhm.
so I don't really think the ending is necessarily like a downer, if that's the right way to say it.
We all enter the screensaver,
Yes, exactly.
right?
Yes, yeah.
Which was pretty cool visual effects at the time in
Yeah,
1980.
yeah. Oh, and I'm sure in the cinema and everything, because I've never seen this
Yeah,
projected in the cinema. I've
yeah,
only ever seen it on the television. So
yeah.
I'm quite sure that was very effective and moving in the cinema as well. So
Yeah. There's a really good David Lynch interview with, you know, Mark Cousins. He did this thing, the
Hmm.
history of film,
Hmm.
and you can find the interview with him if you Google it. And he says a few interesting things in there. And one thing he talks about, this thing, the eye of the duck. Have you heard of David Lynch talk about the eye of the duck? It's a very
I've
David
heard a
Lynch.
lot of Lynch stuff, but yeah, tell us about it. Yeah, doesn't ring a
It's
bell.
very
Yeah.
Lynchian. So
Oh,
basically, a
for
duck
sure. Yeah.
is a beautiful bird when you sort of stop and look at them. And, you know, the beaks are beautiful, the feathers are beautiful, the legs are beautiful, but, you know, everything's beautiful. But he says the thing about them is they all hinge around the eye. Without the eye exactly where it is, this tiny little thing, it wouldn't really work. And so every film of his has the eye of the duck, which is like the sort of the point that where it all sort of coheres in some way
Hmm.
and sort of makes sense. Um, anyway, you look it up and he'll explain it better than I did. But
Yeah.
in this one, he says actually the ending is the eye of the duck. That bit you were
Hmm.
just talking about. That's where it all sort of
mm,
makes sense in a way. Whereas mostly they're in the middle of the film or somewhere, you know, in the film. Not they're not. It's not the payoff. Let's put it like that.
mm.
But in this case, it does. It is the end. Yeah.
That kind of reminds me a lot of sort of like Bellatar movies, you know, like
Hmm.
saying, you know, because all his films are like that. There's all this kind of stuff going on, and it takes a long time to build up, but then there's that point sort of towards the end where all of a sudden it all just kind of pulls together
Hmm.
and you kind of see where it was all going or how it all connected.
Hmm.
So that's I guess kind of the same idea. So yeah. I'm always reminded only when I watch the film, but that this was actually produced by Mel Brooks,
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
which is
And
always
it
like strikes me. I always kind of like do a double take when I see his name, and I'm reminded of that because it's not the kind of film you would associate with Mel Brooks, is it?
No, and this was kind of at the height of his sort of influence. I mean, you know, you could maybe say the mid '70s were like his peak, right after Young Frankenstein, but he was still a very, you know, big mover. But this was kind of an independent film made with Brooks's backing through Paramount, and there's some good sort of supplemental features. I have the Criterion Blu-ray here. There's a nice interview, but you're right. Mel Brooks basically embraced David Brooks. He saw Eraserhead, which Lynch thought was going to torpedo any chance he had, because the project was basically financed by Brooks, and Lynch was the unknown factor in all of this. But Brooks saw Eraserhead with all of its greasy, grimy, sleazy, you know, creature effects and everything, and the weirdness of it, and said, "That's the guy. I want him in this." And it was also good for Lynch to be able to, you know, this is definitely has all those Lynchian moments in it, but it isn't a more sort of mainstream commercialized, you know,
Yeah,
not a
aside
sellout by any
from
means, but it's made to
yeah.
be a popular entertainment, you know, that connects with the broad audiences. Yeah.
Well, that is the one thing I said to my son when he was asking me about David Lynch, because in a way, aside from maybe the straight story, this
Yeah.
is probably his most accessible film, isn't it?
Oh yeah,
Really,
I
like
think
in
so.
terms
Yeah.
of for as a mainstream
Hmm.
accessible film that a mass audience could get into and enjoy. This is
Right.
probably about as accessible as he gets.
That's right. But he got his dream sequences in there and some of the
Yeah.
visual and just some of that kind of visionary stuff.
Mm.
And I'm glad that you know, he had a you know, executive producer behind him like Mel Brooks, who said, "You do your thing. You know, we're not going to try to, you know, homogenize this or really iron out all those wrinkles." Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And it's absolutely worth mentioning John Hurt, because I think this film
Of
so
course,
much
yeah,
hinges
yeah.
on just an absolutely incredible acting talent that the man was, that
Hmm.
even with all of this stuff on him, and just being, he still conveys so much emotion, and he makes so much impact in his performance,
Yeah.
it is just really extraordinary, piece of
Brilliant.
work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's apparently one of the interviews I saw about the sort of making of it. They said that when Mel Brooks saw Eraserhead and he then saw David Lynch, he said, "You're a madman. I love you. You're in."
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely brilliant.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, did you guys have anything else that you wanted to talk about Elephant Man tonight?
Well, one
Any
thing I
other
want to mention
observations?
is that George Lucas offered David Lynch the Return of the Jedi on the strength of the Elephant Man.
Right, right.
Well,
Well, he
I
went and did Dune after
he
this,
went
though, wasn't
Dune,
it?
yeah,
Dune was
yeah.
the thing that he did to follow this up, didn't he?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I believe that
Which,
was the next one. And that's where Lynch said, you know what, I really cannot be assimilated into the system after all, you know.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And Dune is an extraordinary film. I mean, we're not really here to talk about
All
Dune
right.
tonight, but it is one of those films that you could make the argument that it is god awful, just a terrible film. But then at the same time, it is immensely entertaining as
Fascinating. Yeah,
well.
there's so many. I mean,
Yeah,
the Lynchisms are there. Of course, the story was
yeah,
mythic and big already. So yeah,
yeah.
but you're right. That's a whole other sidebar. Let's just cut it off right there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for another, maybe for another episode,
All
another
right.
time. But definitely, folks, if you've never seen The Elephant Man, amazingly, like this is one of those films I just assume at some point everybody has seen it. But I remember I mean, in the end, for personal reasons, I had to pull out. But when we were, every year I do these panto performances down at our local hall here to raise money for charity. And during the rehearsals once, I made a joke about the Elephant Man, and some of the people I was with didn't know what I was on about. They were sort of like
Really?
going, like, huh? Like they didn't sort of get it.
Yeah.
But me, I just have this thing that the Elephant Man, the film, and just the story of the Elephant Man is so much ingrained in our culture, and people know about it, that I just assume that everybody knows about the Elephant Man, but apparently no. So,
No.
so anyway, if you're out there and you've not ever seen the Elephant Man, um, it's time you rectified that. Go out and check it out. There is David held up the Criterion Blu-ray, and I've got the Studio Canal, the recent 4K edition, and it's
Mm.
got this extraordinary box. Like Studio Canal loves to do these really cumbersome packages where you can't get the discs out, and it takes you 3 weeks to try and put it back together again after you've watched it. But when you open this up, it
Oh
actually
wow!
opens up into a facsimile of the model of the church.
Amazing.
So I
Yeah.
thought that was interesting, and I was trying to explain, because when I was getting the disco, my son saw me open this, and he was like, "Well, what's all that about?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"Well, you'll have to wait and watch the film, and then you'll understand the significance of that." But
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna try and
Another
explain.
another faith connection to these, and that he did this
Yeah,
with one hand. He only had one usable hand
That's
yeah,
brilliant.
to
yeah,
make these very, and that some of those models I think still exist. They were preserved, you know. So
Yeah.
yes, amazing. Just an amazing story and an extraordinary person, and
Yeah.
a really great film.
Yeah.
So, unless you guys have any other points you wanted to raise about it, Jonathan, you look like you want to say something
Well, I
else.
was one thing in the interview I wanted to say very quickly is that one of the things in there is that old Mark Cousin says something about angels. He often has angels in his films, and so and there's several angels in The Elephant Man. And Mark Hutchins goes, "Don't literally believe in angels." And David Lynch replies, "Oh, yeah. No, you don't, do you? Yeah. Is that because you were taught to believe in angels as a kid? Have I seen them? No." And then he said, and he just cannot understand that David Lynch has this sort of belief. He says, "You don't literally mean top of the Christmas tree type things, though. I really don't believe that you do." And he said, "There are many things out there that we don't know about, but sometimes, you get certain feelings about." And I just thought, because basically the Elephant Man is met by these sort of angels or angelic presences, I would say. That's one of the things, like the actress, Mr. Treves, and so
these divine messengers that come by at just the right moment to rescue him from peril,
Exactly.
I mean, and even the way Lynch was accepted this offer, the story goes that he was being told that there's some possible projects that he could line up on, and somebody said, "Well, what's the first one?" The Elephant Man. And he says this little bomb went off in his head and said, "That's the movie I'm going to make." And so he's very reliant on these kind of intuitive flashes that he gets. So this is the direction to go. It's not rational. It's not like this deliberative process. It's like, oh, that was your calling. You just do it. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So anyway, that was the last thing I was going to say.
Okay. All right. Well, on that note, then, I think what we're going to do, listeners, is take a very, very short break. From the listener's point of view, it literally will be only mere seconds. So don't run away too far. Keep your ears peeled, because we're going to be back very, 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 very shortly. But gentlemen, let's take a moment to refresh ourselves, to contemplate our next film. And we will return in just a moment. A
walk in space, we're heading out for a walk in space, a walk in space, a walk in space, taking off to a new base.
A Walk in Space, the debut single by Neil Rell. Available to stream or download wherever you get your favourite music.
Thanks for listening to the Film Swap podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving the show a rating or leaving a review. This helps other listeners find the show. You can follow the Film Swap on social media. We're on Twitter and TikTok at Film Swap UK, on Instagram at Film Swap Media, and on YouTube at Film Swap_podcast, and at Facebook at Film Swap the podcast.
And we're back. Welcome back, listeners, and welcome back, Jonathan and David Blakeslee, our special guests tonight. I might take this opportunity, just whilst we're having a break from the films, to if I can figure out where I put it. But I just wanted to mention that David Blakeslee, as well as the wonderful podcasts that he's been doing for years, and definitely worth checking out. But just recently this year, David also was involved in another project that I think is worth pointing out. I'm going to hold this up now. There's a box set from Severin called The Game of Clones, Volume 1 it is as well. Sorry, let me try that again. The Bruceploitation collection. Now, this was produced by a friend of yours, David, named Michael Worth.
That's right, yeah.
Who's an actor and a martial artist, and he's also an aficionado of martial arts films. And he, over the years, has collected a lot of films and paraphernalia of the Bruceploitation genre, and he's produced this lovely box set that's got about 8 or 10 films in it.
It's 12 films plus a documentary called Enter the Clones of Bruce. And Bruceploitation, if you aren't familiar, this is basically after the very shocking and premature death of Bruce Lee, just as he was breaking out into international superstardom with Enter the Dragon. He died. It was kind of, there's kind of a controversy about what was his cause of death, but probably an injury that led to a brain aneurysm of some sort. Anyways, he died, and there was this huge appetite all of a sudden for kung fu movies. And so since Bruce Lee was just beginning to get introduced to popular audiences, the studio production heads in Hong Kong and elsewhere said, well, what if we have an Asian guy who looks enough like Bruce Lee to sort of pass him off? And so there were these characters named Bruce Lee, L-I, or Bruce Lee, L-E, or Dragon Lee. Basically, Bruce Lee imitators who could also do the moves, and maybe not to the highest level that Bruce Lee himself attained, and didn't have that exact charisma that made Bruce Lee such a magnetic performer. But they were serviceable, and they had their own talents and abilities as well. And so there was this kind of rush of Bruceploitation movies, casting somebody who looked enough like Bruce Lee to kind of carry on. And some of them were made as direct sequels to earlier films that Bruce Lee made, and others were kind of in that vein. And so, Michael, who he found my podcast just, and approached me as a potential guest. And I had him on to talk about different like Zatoichi films and Chinese martial arts, like A Touch of Zen, the wuxia Chinese genre.
I love Touch of Zen, yeah.
Right. And Michael has traveled the world tracking down these last remnants of these Bruceploitation films. As the title implies, these are exploitation films that not meant to be high art or even permanently cared for. They were almost like magazines that were published to just kind of distribute, make some money, throw them away, who cares? And
a lot of them were in really poor state in terms of archival materials and things. Yeah.
There's one beat up print with burned in subtitles. That's the only but Michael is a kid who watched Enter the Dragon as a young teen or maybe even pre-adolescent, and said, I want to do that. I want to be that guy. And he taught himself, or he did teach him. I'm sure he went to academies and got training, but he became a professional martial artist. He was on TV shows in the 80s and 90s, like Acapulco Heat, and he did other acting roles. He's also directed films. So he's established himself as a career in the film industry. And, he just befriended himself to me, and I've really enjoyed just getting to know him. And actually, he and I have some ongoing, ideas about future collaborations, but he invited me to do a commentary track for a film called Cameroon Connection, which is a martial arts film set in the nation of Cameroon with a few scenes shot in Paris, starring Bruce Lee, L-E, in the 1980s, after the Bruceploitation phenomenon had kind of died down. But Bruce Lee continued to want to do work, and he was recruited by a guy named Alphonse Benny, who was a Cameroonian musical pop star who wanted to get into making action movies. And so he recruited Bruce Lee to be part of this African set martial arts action flick. So I drew the assignment of doing a commentary track, and I was just so fascinated by this unlikely combination of different elements and cultures and talents. And so I did the commentary track on one of the films in that really beautiful box set. So thank you, David, for mentioning that. Yeah.
Well, it's terrific. I definitely just want to highlight that to listeners because it is a really fun box. There's lots of really fun films in there, and it's loads and loads of entertainment.
And there is a volume 2 on the way. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and there's a volume 2 on the way as well, which I think, David, you said you might be involved with in some capacity.
Yeah, it's still kind of coming together. No imminent announcements or anything, but I think Michael's comfortable saying, yeah, we want to do more of that. So it's been a fun thing to be a part of.
Yeah, great. Well, I definitely just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention while we got David here. Give a little plug to that because it is terrific and it's cool. David's commentary is great, and that film is really interesting, really a bit bizarre, but in a fun, like really entertaining way.
I think for most listeners, you can say you have never seen anything quite like this.
It's definitely a singular. It would definitely fit in with a couple of episodes ago. Was it when Jonathan and I did an episode about WTF films, and we picked out those films that are just completely, totally unique and one of a kind, bizarre sort of excursions. And I think that one would definitely fit in there within that wheelhouse. So definitely worth a look. But anyway, let's get
Getting
back
back
to
to
our
the main
film
subject
tonight.
there. Yeah.
Yes, because tonight we've got a triple bill that we're talking about films about keeping the faith, and which again we talked about at the beginning could mean no, it could be interpreted in a number of ways, and in this case, this film I think. Um, uh, is a film that I guess you could describe that it was meant very much as sort of a Christian film or a film of you know or Catholic, I guess. Is that right? I should be
Hmm.
clear that even though like this literally is one of my absolute favorite films, and that's the reason I picked it. But also I should say like I myself like I don't uh, I wouldn't say that I'm a religious person per se, and I'm not um, uh, I guess what's the term that people use to describe someone who's agnostic? Is that the right term when you say
That's
that you're?
one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yep.
because I'm obviously I'm open-minded and and I accept other people's sort of beliefs and ideas and things like that, but I don't necessarily identify with any particular religion or anything. But I find this film to be just incredibly moving and
Hmm.
entertaining and really powerful in a really simple way. And as I said, I think it's one of my absolute favorite films. It's a film I revisit at least probably once a year,
Mm.
and I think hands down it has one of the most poetic and beautiful endings of any film that there is.
Mm.
And I just think it's a really wonderful, life affirming, um, um, powerful film about people um, going through life, sort of sticking to their principles and their ideas and their beliefs, no matter what's going on around them or the people that they encounter. And it's about people leading by example, I guess, is the way in terms of being kind, being generous, and all those things that are kind of good in people, and sort of sticking to those principles and just demonstrating them, even in situations when um, you're being ridiculed or you're being bullied or you're in dangerous situations, or even just day to day dealing with petty squabbles and all these things about kind of navigating that and staying true to yourself. So even if you take the religion out of it, it's kind of about that too, about just kind of staying true to yourself and your own ideals, even when the environment around you might make that challenging. So I think it's a really fun film. So sorry, I should probably tell people what it's called.
What a buildup.
It's another thing. I think regular listeners will know that I do that all the time. I'll start talking about something enthusiastically, and then 10 minutes later realize I haven't even said what the title of it is yet. But anyway, this is a film that, well, it's known by a couple of different titles depending on what territory that it was originally shown in, but it's known mostly, I think, as The Flowers of St. Francis. And it's a film by Rossellini that was made in, well, the early 50s. It came out in 1950.
Yep.
And it is basically about St. Francis of Assisi
Hmm.
and his small group of followers, and it is based on the literature under that name, and it basically, rather than it's not really a biographical film as such. The film is just a series of vignettes
Hmm.
that are tell separate stories that sort of demonstrate the sort of the principles and the teachings of Saint Francis,
Yeah.
and he has a small congregation, and he's been given permission by the Pope. This is how the story kind of starts, because there is a bit of a narrative arc that
Hmm.
flows through it, even though it is made up of these sort of separate vignettes. At the beginning, he's been given permission by the Pope to preach and to establish his little ministry and go out and preach to people and try and spread the word. And so he sets up in a small sort of cottage, almost like a little sort of area that they kind of take over. And
yeah, they're kind of out in the country, like nobody else wants this land, so set up a little settlement there, and it's a communal
that's,
lifestyle.
I think, the word
right?
I was looking
Yeah.
for, really.
Okay.
But they kind of set up this little settlement, and then they use that as their base, and then they go out and they preach to people and spread the word around. And through these vignettes, you see various situations and how either Francis himself deals with those issues and the kind of the things that he teaches the others, or it shows some of the others and sort of some of the things that they experience and how they deal with them. And some of the stories are, well, really most of them are they're very gentle and humorous and good natured. And even though the film ostensibly is about St. Francis of Assisi, it seems to focus quite a bit on one of his followers and his misadventures, if you will, because he's a very gentle, simple man. And sometimes in his exuberance, he kind of does things in a way that maybe causes a little bit of consternation and things to some of the other people who live around them or people within his group. And
yeah, he's the guy who will literally give you the shirt off his back, right? I mean, the old cliche.
Absolutely.
He's very pure-hearted,
that.
and that's what you told me to do, is to be generous and kind. And if somebody needs something and I can give it to him, I'm going to help him out, even if it's kind of, sets him back or creates problems.
Quite literally, doesn't he?
Yes.
Like if he's given an instruction, he takes it quite literally without any sort of nuance or interpretation. So sometimes that can lead to some comic situations. And so this is what the film is like. It's just lovely and really, like I said, life affirming and really beautiful. And again, I think the ending is just lovely, and it kind of gets me every time, even though I've probably watched this film maybe sort of 20 times in my life.
Yes.
I would say I always find it really affecting, the ending, because we have them basically breaking up and spreading out, and it's incredibly poignant and poetic because he has them all spin around and fall where they may, and then head off in whatever direction that they've landed in. And it's kind of poignant in a way because all these people who've lived together and had all these experiences together and who are friends, and there's a lot of love and mutual respect amongst them all, but that they're all separating and going their separate ways, and they may never see each other again. So it's kind of sad and poignant in that sense, but then it's also very beautiful because that they're going to go out and share their the same thing like we talked about with John Merrick, is that idea of like a really gentle souls spreading this message of kind of hope and love and through out in the world, and they're all going to go out and spread it, and so it's a really beautiful ending, and I just love this film. It's short and it's sweet, literally sweet, and it's just so good natured and so life affirming and so fun, and I just love it. And so I thought, for this subject matter, I thought this was the film that I wanted to recommend to people to see. And now over to you. What did you guys think?
Well, John, I can give you first swipe at it. I've already hit a few things to say. I'll go. Yeah.
Well, I've seen it a couple of times in the last once in the last week, and then once I think last year. And really great film. Very simple. This is one of the interesting things, is that the stars of the film, or the actors, they were all monks.
They're the real deal, right?
They're the real deal, exactly. And you get that feeling that they do have this sort of, I don't know, beautiful countenance. Let's put it like that, sort of shining faces and sort of innocent looks. and which is really lovely. And it's because it is a sort of religious film, which could sort of put you off, but it is very funny actually. There's loads.
Oh yeah.
One of
it's
the
not
nice,
uptight. Yeah, it's not a repressive religious film by any means, right?
Exactly, because I think in the UK, or certainly in the US, it was called The Flowers of St. Francis, which is the name of the book that was produced about his life, St. Francis's life. But in Italian, it was Francesco Guerriere de Dio, means the Fool of God, which is a very different sort of title.
It sure is. Yep.
Or God's Gesture, I think. In some places it was called God's Gesture as well. Yeah.
Sorry. But anyway, he was a sort of fool or a jester in a sense, and especially Brother Juniper. But they both have this sort of innocent quality, which is the sort of quality of a jester, and it's really, really lovely. One thing that I really liked is the sort of the prayers in it. There's a certain amount of prayers in it. So it starts off when the credits with from a quote from Corinthians. That's a famous one. And then later on, he says the Lord's Prayer to the birds. Of course, he's famous for sort of preaching to the birds, which is beautiful. And actually, this is one thing that connects it to The Elephant Man. Sorry, bring it back to that very briefly, because in that interview with Mark Cousins, David Lynch says that Anthony Hopkins was saying the Lord's Prayer, apparently because he just recovered from sort of his sort of a drinking problem, Anthony Hopkins. And so when he first sees the Elephant Man, he's apparently been saying the Lord's Prayer, and that's when that tear sort of appears in his eye and rolls down his cheek, which is an amazingly moving part of the film. Anyway, but both films have this in it. I suppose one you can hear, one you can't, but they're both, and that's something that I found very, it's just beautiful the way that happens out in nature, and the spinning around, as you say, that end where they sort of going off in their different directions. That's sort of part of their innocence as well, because they're just sort of in a way, they're sort of fooling around, but it's obviously something that has great consequence because they sort of disappear and they're going off in different directions. But it's sort of they're surrendering in that moment as well. So it's a great film.
But you're right; it's also very playful and sort of joyful as well. And they have a laugh while they're doing it. And
it's very childlike. It's like let's make ourselves dizzy. We'll just spin around, fall down, and just walk whatever way we're pointing. That there's kind of like this kind of carefree, cast yourself to the wind quality there. And that childlike faith. I mean, that is a biblical principle. It's simple, trusting service and dependence on God. Promptings by the Holy Spirit, if you want to use that kind of language, to just do what in your conscience and your heart is the right thing to do, even if that means it comes at a sort of a cost of self-sacrifice. And that's really kind of what the film is about. And John, when you were talking about the connections to the Elephant Man, the other one that occurred to me, I thought maybe we were going to mention was Francis' embrace of a leper. There's a point where he's walking at night and he hears this bell ringing, a cowbell, which is basically the warning that an unclean, cursed person is coming your way, and they were obliged to wear those because they would be, perhaps put to death if they didn't, give the pious, righteous people chance to clear out before the leper crosses their path. And there is St. Francis hugging the leper and embracing him and accepting him with his deformities, with his disease. And the leper's just accepting that, but he knows he can't really settle down. He's just got to keep moving along on his way. And that's another very compassionate moment within the film that I think really does connect to the Elephant Man as well.
Well, there's that moment again. If I could just jump in about the Elephant Man, because there's that really touching moment when he brings John Merrick home for dinner and he meets his wife, and his wife is very kind to him, and he at one
but she has to sort of clench her teeth and take a breath and get ready for this too.
Absolutely.
It doesn't come natural, right?
It affected him in the fact that he burst out crying, and then he just said that this is the first time a woman has ever been kind to me. And that was, and that was, quite a powerful moving moment. And
Mm-hmm.
it's the same with the leper with St. Francis, because he's taken aback by the, someone's actually touching me, someone's actually showing me,
Yeah.
kindness and love and all these things. And it's something that's so alien to them in their circumstances that's a really powerful,
Mm.
um, very powerful moment, very moving moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a movie that I've watched numerous times as well. My wife actually bought it for me many years ago when I was just beginning to build my Criterion collection. She had seen the accumulation of discs on my shelves, and she got me this disc as a birthday present because she thought, well, that sounds like a pretty interesting film. And so I have, sort of sentimental personal attachments, but I did a podcast about this years ago. And I've definitely watched this movie just out of sort of, maybe not quite 20 times, David, but probably approaching 10 times, I would say, where I just want to sort of reconnect with this beautiful St. Francis character. And this film depicts his story in kind of that, Italian neo-realistic mode, which isn't all, beams of sunshine and this kind of glossy stained glass window treatment. It's putting him in a very particular time and place with poverty and with some suffering, and it doesn't really get into the politics, but you see some little moments of this wasn't just a time of people simplistically prancing around in their robes and sandals and sharing the fruit of the land. I mean, there's pressure and there's cruelty and there's violence, just that there's been all throughout human history. And there is that scene, where they're kind of in the robbers' camp there, and Ginepro that you mentioned earlier, David, he literally gets tossed around like this a rag doll, to the amusement of these brutal barbarian types, who are exploiting the fact that this is a simple, non-violent, diminutive person who they can kind of do whatever they want to do with. And yet the power of his testimony through the weakness and through the humility, kind of puts this, beastly master of the troop back on his heels. He does not know what to do with someone who is that innocent and that pure of heart. And that's just another, again, thinking about when this movie was made, 1950, World War II is just a few years back, and everybody's living memory. Every member of the audience has been through the deprivations and hardships of full-on war, and the poverty and the violence and the exploitation and the corruption and all of that. This is Rossellini talking to his own society, saying, we got to kind of get back. We got to rebuild this society, and let's try to do it in a way that learns from the examples of our ancestors. And he took some heat because he didn't treat Francis and his troop with the kind of pious reverence that might have been expected from the kind of official tradition of the teaching. He brought him down to earth and almost made him like that comical figure, God's jester or the fool for God. There, after centuries of veneration had built up, St. Francis was like this, he's like almost like the fourth person of the Trinity or something like that, and Rossellini is reminding us that, he was just a guy. He was just an ordinary human who saw what was happening around him, took these principles of nonviolence and humility and service and humbling oneself. He took them seriously and said, let's try this out. Let's apply these ideas and see what happens. And, he's become a great figure of history because of the tradition and the faithfulness that he inspired and the acts of service to those who are, the least among us.
It's interesting to contrast this again with First Reform, because there where you see the institutionalized religion and the conformity and the social kind of expectations and the rigid structure of that.
Right. We got to keep the donors happy. We can't offend
exactly.
the big
and
money.
Just the formality of it all, and that sort of austere kind of, sort of side of faith Whereas here with St. Francis and his group, you can see, like you say, that like they've just pared it right down to the actual just living it day to day without any sort of artifice or any sort of structure around it, but just living with those principles and those ideals on the ground, you know, amongst people, and about sharing and giving and living in that way. So there is quite a contrast between those two sort of looks at faith and about
Yeah.
how people exercise their faith. So I think that's kind of an interesting sort of comparison to make as well when we're looking at the different films and how they tie together. So
Yeah, I think he's trying to portray Saint Francis as a real human being rather than this venerated, saintly, you know, mystical character who somehow, you know, does not have all of the temptations or the attachments to, you know, materialism and consumerism or prosperity or power that, you know, the rest of us, you know, kind of struggle with. No, he was right there, and I think, you know, by whittling these stories and kind of taking the sort of supernatural element out of them, that may have even sort of shocked some people, but I think he did a brilliant job of capturing the essence and the heart and saying, here's how this would look and feel, you know, if you strip away some of that, you know, that gloss that has accumulated over the years.
yeah, it's quite like Pasolini's
The Gospel of Saint Matthew.
Gospel of Saint Matthew's, because
Yeah.
it takes that same kind of approach of just sort of stripping everything down to just sort of just show real people, and you know, showing Jesus as a real person and kind of a revolutionary, and putting it within the context of, you know, on the ground in real life, and having it more sort of stripped down like that. So it is that kind of, as you were saying, that kind of reminded me of that film as well, which is a really great film as well.
Have either of you guys followed much of other Rossellini films at all? I mean, he's a very fascinating character as an individual. Of course, this is also the same time that he was involved in a very scandalous affair with Ingrid Bergman, the, you know, Swedish moved to Hollywood superstar, Casablanca, and all the other Academy Award winning stuff that she did. I mean, Ingrid Bergman was like one of the biggest stars on the planet. She kind of gave up her Hollywood royalty and the relative ease that she could have had because she wanted to make artistically challenging and adventurous films. And she's quite an extraordinary person herself. So Ingrid and Roberto got together as a couple to great scandal. I mean, she was denounced personally on the floor of the United States Senate for engaging in this because, it was quite brutal because she was elevated as a golden princess of Hollywood, and you know, she's incredibly beautiful and talented. She had a sort of a substance about her that made her more than just a pretty face, but you know, she basically abandoned not only her husband but a child. She had a daughter, but she pursued this relationship with Rossellini. They did end up getting married. Isabella Rossellini, who was, you know, David Lynch movies, Blue Velvet, that's their daughter, you know. And so Rossellini himself had his own sort of worldly thing going on while he was making this movie. And so that was another reason that maybe the movie was kind of challenged by some of the proper folks of Italian and European society. But this is also a preview of some of the stuff that he did later in his career, where he was really about, you know, learning from history. He did this whole series of films for television in the 1960s and into the 70s, where he was really trying to say, let's look at the great figures of history. And he, I think in a certain way, maybe considered himself as in sort of that circle. Like he was an intellectual and a thought influencer and a cultural statesman of sorts. And he wanted to elevate his audience by creating art that was challenging, but also edifying, if you can use that word, to say, let's find a better way. And he even, in a sort of naive way, thought about television as a way to reach the masses with educational, informative, uplifting material. And this movie, although it was made for cinematic release, kind of is a preview of some of the direction that he moved in towards the end of his career, by saying, let's talk about Blaise Pascal, or the Renaissance characters, the Socrates and Plato. Let's put them in these historic settings and try to capture the essence of their times. And I think he's doing that with this film, capturing the life and essence of St. Francis.
Wow.
Yeah, if people are more interested in those films, David, you did your series talking about the Eclipse, series of box sets, and Criterion. I don't know if you can still get that, but there is a box set of Rossellini's history television films that was available, and I mean, I got to admit, they are kind of a little bit like kind of homework watching them, but they are very kind of interesting and rewarding if you sort of kind of, if you're willing to put that effort in.
Yeah, if you want to understand,
quite interesting.
like Rene Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Well, he's the father of modern philosophy. Well, let's get into the world that shaped this guy. Why did he say that? Why does that statement resonates after all these centuries? So he wants to get into these worlds that really have had a long-lasting, influence on Western culture, and St. Francis is certainly one. I mean, our current Pope is named after him, but I know that's a little bit tangential to the essence of this film, but I just really love the simplicity of how he presents it, and the fact that he's willing to tap into sort of the great chapters of cultural history to say, what does that have to say to us today? How can we learn and apply this?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Have either of you seen Brother Sun, Sister Moon?
That was a Zeffirelli film. I remember hearing about it. I may have seen pieces of it on TV, but he's the guy who did like Romeo and Juliet,
exactly,
and then Jesus of Nazareth. So these very opulent productions, and I think he kind of romanticizes Francis and Sister Claire as these kind of proto hippies or something like that.
It's very different. I mean, I guess the message is not too dissimilar. I mean, it's still
no. There's a linkage there for sure.
Definitely, but it's much more sort of flamboyant and made in the early 70s, and I guess it's more sort of
it's color, it's sunshine, it's lyrical, it's kind of romantic, if you will, and it is kind of tapping into that vibe of let's just get back to nature and be one and soak up the sunshine, kind of that, kind of living out the Woodstock dream or fantasy, if you will, and just strip away all the consumerism and the materialism and the violence and the war. A very fashionable message for its time. I think it's a good film, definitely worth checking out, but very much comes from a different sort of cultural vantage point than Rossellini in 1950 in the post-war. I mean, Italy was still in a lot of poverty. There was still a lot of damage and destruction that had not been cleaned up yet. And we had not gotten to the economic miracle that made like La Dolce Vita a thing 10 years later. Yeah.
Would you guys say that, because I mentioned I've watched this film a lot. It's a favorite of mine, and it's one of my kind of cheering up films, like along with sort of a couple of the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and a couple other things. This is the kind of my go-to when I kind of want something that's going to kind of pick up my spirits a little bit and sort of make me feel good. This is one of my feel-good films. And so I do watch it. Like I said, I probably see it a good once a year. This is my old Masters of Cinema DVD, which is probably seen the inside of the player 20 times. Yeah,
my Criterion disc.
Yeah, there's the Criterion one. Unfortunately, I think this is out of print now, and it's never been upgraded to Blu-ray, has it? And
I don't think the Criterion is DVD only as well. I think it's just so low-key and humble. It's not going to get the fancy robes 4K restoration.
DVD has become the Francis St. Francis kind of version of home media, I guess.
That's right.
but no frills. But you know, it's a good disc and it's perfectly watchable. But this is a film I would love to see get a high definition upgrade because I think it definitely deserves it. And I don't know what's going on with that, what's taken so long, but it seems to, because I was looking to see, because obviously when we talk about these films, we want to tell people how they can access them.
Mm-hmm.
So this one's a bit trickier. I did notice though that right now it is on YouTube. We're talking, this is December of 2024, and it's currently on YouTube that you can watch it there. And I don't know if it's how else you might be able to access it. Is the Criterion one still in print?
Yeah, the Criterion. I believe it's still in print. Maybe we have to look at. I think it's on the Criterion channel as well. I know. In fact, I know I have watched it on the Criterion channel, or at least was kind of doing some tune-ins, and I think it may even have some of the special features attached. It's even works as, even if you don't want to watch the whole 87 minutes of it, you can just watch a chapter or two just for a little pick me up, a little boost, because they are like little stories or little vignettes or scenarios, and sometimes just one of them is enough to kind of give you that little reality check or shift of perspective.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, because this is, and although it wasn't originally intended as such, this is kind of our Christmas episode because we're in December and it's only a couple of weeks away from Christmas, and this will be going out just before Christmas. So this is a terrific, well, any of these three films would be, I think, in their own way, but this would be a terrific Christmas film, a terrific film and highly appropriate to watch on Christmas or Christmas Eve or on Boxing Day to get it on and just spend an hour and a half with St. Francis and his followers, because it's got all the right messaging and all the right vibe for Christmas. So
that's right.
I nominate this as a great Christmas movie. Although I wouldn't, say that you can watch it all year round. It doesn't have to be confined strictly to Christmas, of course. So.
Right.
So maybe if you're looking for an alternative to Elf this year, maybe look this one out because it's definitely worth it. It's a lovely, really lovely little film.
I had to get mine secondhand on eBay because.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, that's great that you could find one, because I think the Masters of Cinema has been out of print for a while, and I got it when it first came out, and I've had it for years, so I'm fortunate in that sense. But I think now I did have a quick look, and it does seem like it's a bit more difficult to get a hold of. But hopefully in the United States, it seems like it might be slightly easier to get hold of. But definitely it's worth searching out. So folks, try and find it. And the same with the other two films that we've talked about tonight as well.
Yeah, and I'll give Rossellini just another plug. I think he's not the most like flashy of directors. He established the reputation of neorealism with Open City and the War trilogy, famously Criterion Spy Number 500, films that really had a pretty big impact in terms of kind of stripping down some of the fantasy escapism elements, even of like classic Hollywood stuff, and just say, let's talk about how life really is. And he's just a fascinating figure. His whole career is just really interesting and challenging, but it's like he was, kind of back to the faith theme. It seems like he was answering some kind of a question or this higher calling that he wanted to pursue. He was not a guy who was out to make hit films or to become he was successful. He was suave. He was stylish, but that wasn't really what drove him. And I just feel like, he's a director who's easy to kind of overlook because he doesn't have some of the cult of personality stuff that you have like the Bergmans or Kurosawas or Fellinis, who I all love, but he's a little bit more, down to earth and literally, and just a figure worth kind of getting into. So I'm really glad that you chose this one, David. It's a great opportunity to talk about this film again.
Yeah, and it's great. And you're right that Rossellini is more known for his very early films, but definitely some of his later work is really interesting as well. And I think it's become a little bit more obscure. Yeah. So it is definitely worth going and checking out. Was there anything else you guys wanted to say about the Flowers of St. Francis before we signed off?
Nope.
No, I think we've covered it. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I really deeply appreciate the invitation.
Yeah.
It is nice to kind of get these off of my queue because I've got other things I'm working on now. But these are three really substantial films that I think we certainly could have probably gone on longer about, but I think we gave good coverage, and I appreciate the chance to hang out with you guys for a couple hours today.
Definitely.
Oh yeah, well, it's great, David. It's been great having you back, and we hope you'll join us again in the future for talk about some other great films. It's always great catching up with you, and we want to wish you and your family the best for the holiday season and for the coming year.
And likewise.
And thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
And on that note, I wanted to just take a brief minute, if you'll allow me to say, because this obviously is going to be the last episode of Film Swap for 2024, and we want to take a minute just to thank everyone who's joined us this year and listened in. I know the last few months, Jonathan and I haven't been particularly prolific. For a number of things keep kind of getting in the way and stopping us from settling in and doing lots of recording. But we definitely have been having conversations around next year. And I think we're kind of looking at maybe in the new year, we might look at doing a bit of a sort of a soft reboot, if you will, of Film Swap, and maybe sort of relaunching it maybe as a second season or something, and sort of trying to get back on a bit more of a regular schedule. And we hope David will come back, and some of our other guests will come back. And we are also having some discussions with some really interesting people who hopefully will come, and we'll be able to organize to get them to sit down with us too and have a chat about some cool films. So we want to thank everyone who's listened in over the year, and I want to also say thank you to some of our great guests. Teniola Seiju, who came on to talk a bit about some Japanese anime, and definitely Julia Vollmuller from the Dutch Kinematheek, who came. She was an amazing, she took the time out to talk to us about film restoration and silent films and things. It was absolutely amazing. So thank you very much, Julia, for coming on and joining us. Brad McDermott came on and talked to us as well about the artistic impulse, and that was a great conversation. And I just again want to thank the listeners and the people who've following us on our social media things. I hope everyone has a great holiday and a happy new year. And Jonathan and I will be back in January to swap some more great films.
Yes.
So until then, folks, take care, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Film Swap podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving the show a rating or leaving a review. This helps other listeners find the show. You can follow the Film Swap on social media. We're on Twitter and TikTok at Film Swap UK, on Instagram at Film Swap Media, and on YouTube at Film Swap_podcast. And at Facebook at Film Swap the Podcast.
Oh, the things these nerdy middle-aged men get up to.